funding source to support the undertakings and activities of a specific urban renewal area. So let's go ahead and talk about the property that has brought us together this evening. The property for consideration to be a new urban renewal area is part of the approximate 300-acre Sand Creek Industrial Superfund site. That site was identified as Superfund because former waste management practices, spills, and explosions did contaminate the soil, air, groundwater, and surface water with hazardous chemicals. That said, since the area was first identified as a Superfund, the EPA has conducted several 5-year reviews of the property. The most recent review concluded that remedy efforts continue to be protective of health and the environment. Of that 300-acre site, the capped landfill is approximately 65 acres. And as indicated previously, the original polluters created significant environmental challenges and impacts that will require extensive cleanup and monitoring efforts. So this slide provides an outline of the property for potential development and illustrates the probable boundaries of a new urban renewal area. So in the upper left and bottom right of your screen, you can see the areas outlined in blue would represent the property in question. And the other 2 images on the slide show site conditions from last month. So as you can see, the area is certainly in need of cleanup. And in February of this year, CA Ventures, a real estate investment company, approached city staff with an interest in purchasing, cleaning up, and developing that area, again, outlined in blue. Staff has already shared their initial development proposal with our city council. And we'd also like to share that since we did initially approach council with the development proposal, our crews have responded to numerous dumpings on the site, with the most recent cleanup effort occurring on June 23rd. Our code enforcement team also sent a notice of code violation on June 21st to Dr. Reddy, who is the current property owner. Upon re-inspection this afternoon, we did find that the site is out of compliance with city code. As such, our team will schedule a contractor to conduct a site cleanup. Now, once the current property owner sells his land to CA Ventures later this year, then CA Ventures would be ready and they'd be the ones to start a more extensive site cleanup and environmental cleanup process. So separately from that, city staff is attempting to collaborate with Denver to clean up the south side of 48th Avenue, which technically sits outside of the property area, but it is outside of Commerce City's boundary. This is CA Ventures' current draft development plan. They estimate that they will develop these 65 acres into an approximate 840,000 square foot site with industrial, flex, warehouse, manufacturing, and distribution space. Since the site is currently vacant and in need of cleanup, community development and city manager office staff are generally supportive of this initial proposal. But please note that the plans shared tonight have not yet gone through our development review process, so they're not necessarily inclusive of necessary public improvements, road standards, etc. Because of the need to revitalize that project area, we are supportive of their desire to go ahead and develop that site. In order to help with the investment needed for environmental remediation and public improvement construction on the site, CA Ventures has requested the formation of a new urban renewal area. City and CA Ventures staff did approach the City Council with an overview of the project in March and May, and Council also provided general support for the redevelopment efforts. Now, redeveloping the capped landfill site will bring many benefits to the community. Some of the more notable ones include the removal of conditions of blight that pose health, safety, and aesthetic concerns, enhancement of overall community perception and character of that area, new and improved public infrastructure, economic benefits to the surrounding community, sustainable building that will create reliable employment opportunities, increase in the value of surrounding businesses, the attraction of new businesses, and attraction of new residents. Then we also have two benefits that fit into the larger picture of development. In a nutshell, the goal of the Commerce City Urban Renewal Authority is to remove blight, and this redevelopment project would achieve that goal. Further, establishing the site as an urban renewal area and allowing for that TIF reimbursement to the developer would help to construct those needed public infrastructure improvements. Any TIF reimbursement agreement that we executed would be based on CA's ability to deliver a high quality development, and that TIF would be dispersed after vertical development occurs. But of course, before we get to that point, we would first need to form a new urban renewal area. Colorado Revised Statute outlines the 4 steps that must be taken in order to do this. Step 1 is to conduct that before mentioned blight study. The study is essentially a property conditions assessment that documents if 4 of the 11 blight factors exist for the proposed geographic area. The study would include a summary and a conclusive analysis if blight conditions do exist. Step 2 is to create a county impact statement that outlines the anticipated impacts of the proposed urban renewal area plan on Adams County. That impact statement would include a summary of the proposed development program and timetable assumptions during a 25-year analysis period. It would also include a summary of impacts to Adams County that include property tax revenue sales, tax revenue, and county services. Lastly, it would include a tax increment financing analysis for that same 25-year period for the survey area. Step 3 of the URA formation process is to hold TIF negotiations with taxing entities in order to determine the amount of property tax increment revenue sharing that would occur. The 4th and final step in the formation process is to create an urban renewal area plan. So we have one of these for all of our existing URA areas. And essentially those plans address elimination and prevention of blight, a cooperation plan to achieve the best use of land to deliver a quality environment, an outline for urban renewal activities, a place for the enforcement of state and local laws, implementation tools, as well as associated site activities. And that plan would actually be formally adopted by the Commerce City City Council, although we would of course keep the board involved throughout the entire process. In an effort to keep the project moving in a timely manner, staff has gone ahead and drafted a request for proposals to secure a vendor to conduct the blight study, county impact statement, and the delivery of an urban renewal plan. So again, the main purpose of our discussion tonight is to request your approval for commissioning and funding that procurement process. That procurement would not exceed an authorized amount of $75,000, which would be initially funded by the CCURA. However, staff will engage the developer, being CA Ventures, to recoup the cost for funding the study, impact, and urban renewal plan. In addition to all of that, staff proposes that the board utilize Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, Schreck to assist the vendor on the development agreements and URA formation. And we have Representative Caitlin Quanders here this evening to address questions about that process. Before staff publishes that request for proposals, CA Ventures would need to submit a detailed entitlement and construction schedule. They also need to provide a comprehensive project pro forma, their projected TIF capacity analysis, and any closing terms on the land with conditions and deliverable milestones. Thank you for your time. That concludes my presentation for the evening. Staff is available to answer any questions or concerns that you have in order to help your decision regarding giving us the permission to commission and fund the procurement once CA Ventures has submitted all of the necessary information to staff. I'll stop my share for now, but I'm happy to go back to any slides if needed.
Does anybody on the board have any questions for staff regarding this presentation? Board Member Alan Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Ms. Laurie, for the presentation. Have a few questions. Do you know when the most recent EPA review was done?
Not off the top of my head. I know they do it in the 5-year increments, but I can certainly find out and let the board know. And honestly, I'll check right now, see if it's on the website.
Then have a few questions. On that slide where you said it's part of a 300-acre industrial Superfund site, for those that don't know, can you explain to us a little bit what that means, a Superfund site?
Absolutely. So essentially, this Superfund site in particular occurred because of on-site operations, including waste management practices, where there were spills and explosions at the site that contaminated the soil, air, groundwater, and surface with different hazardous chemicals. And so even though cleanup has occurred, the EPA, they took a look at the site, and I will say that it has since been taken off of their national Superfund program list. But that doesn't mean that additional monitoring and environmental cleanup is not necessary.
Because I just kind of was looking myself and researching them. I believe the most recent the EPA report was just done in September of last year. And then just from reviewing that, do you know, is it true that in 1977, 2 explosions killed 2 men and injured 5 others, and it was traced to the migration of methane gas from the landfill? Is that correct?
I would assume if you found that on the EPA website itself, their epa.gov, then that would be correct. Unfortunately, my site history does not go back quite that far. But again, that's something I'd be happy to check on their webpage.
Okay, but it's not that far. It is included in, that's what's concerning. If staff is reviewing the most recent report, it states that in there from September of last year. So I brought that up. I wanted to know what's been done to correct it.
If I may weigh in, Jenna.
Sure.
Board members, good evening. Thanks for having me tonight. Jason Rogers, Deputy City Manager, just to put that on the record. If I may ask, Board Member Alan Thomas, is the question that you're asking in relation to the potential impacts related to the future development of the site?
Correct. Yeah, because that's what I want to know. If it's stated in the report from last year, I want to know, has anything been done, to protect, if it is going to be developed now? It did say 2 explosions killed 2 men and injured 5 others in the report because of methane gas. So has anything been done to correct that?
So great questions, ma'am. What I can share with you is, obviously I can't speak to obviously the activities that occurred at the time of the accident, as we don't have all of the information, but what I can assure you and what's been shared with us, and having spoken with both CDPHE and EPA staff, they, as for any use of this site, would be required to undertake an update to their environmental covenants, which quite frankly outline the restrictions and or the conditions in which they're able to develop for the intended end use. I can share with you that they have been having an ongoing conversation with both entities on the updating of this environment, which would then take into account any, I would call RMP, risk management plan, and or a materials recovery plan to ensure that certain penetrations within the CAP landfill do not occur, and that certain mitigation of methane gas is also mitigated to ensure a high level of safety and security for the property. And it's until such time that that environmental covenant has met the federal and state requirements that they would not be permitted to move forward with any action or development, quite frankly, putting a shovel in the ground on said piece of property. It is also required as part of that environmental covenant that any action that is taken by the property owner or the developer or the city for actual vertical construction or horizontal infrastructure, we are to make the EPA aware so that they could conduct their review of the entitlements of the construction drawings, once again, to ensure that they are meeting the environmental covenant as stated and approved by them, by they as the experts and the approving body, so that they can take that next step. So they will be making sure going forward that they have met every necessary criteria from a safety and general welfare standard, not only for those who are on the property, but those that are in and around the property as it relates to neighboring owners and tenants.
Okay, so the blight study doesn't involve anything with the methane gas, or is
No,
that
ma'am.
totally separate?
Those are two separate actions, ma'am. Once again, the blight study is tied to, once again, have you met the definition of blight within under the state law, the ability to actually build on said property, given the environmental conditions that exist, stand wholly with EPA and CDPHE. Quite frankly, if CDPHE and EPA do not grant a revised environmental covenant, and there's nothing that we've received from them that says that that should be the case. But for scenarios or purposes, if they say no, then it goes nowhere because, quite frankly, they can't do anything on it because of the environmental impacts.
And if I may interject real quickly, so you were accurate, ma'am, that the latest report was conducted in September of last year. And it looks like that report actually indicated that methane levels have been going down on the site. And so the EPA still flags it as redevelopable. But again, CA Ventures would have to work with the EPA and CDPHE at a very extensive level to redevelop the property.
And just
Yeah.
one additional item, I'll weigh in with one item. That's the reason they need the tax increment financing, is to mitigate the environmental issues. So that would be dealing with the methane and settlement of the ground and that type of thing. Metro district funds cannot be used for that purpose.
Yeah, because that was just a concern if, like I said, with the 2 people getting killed and 5 others injured, I hope, we could make sure, get an current update on the methane gas. And then also in the report, can staff tell the mayor and city council how many operable units are on the 300 acres?
I unfortunately don't have that information readily available.
Because it'd been nice to get some information, I feel, presented to the mayor and city council on that latest report, because it gives a lot of information. And with that, it'd been nice to have that included in the PowerPoint as well, because it addresses some serious concerns. Because from what I read, there's a total of 6.
Mhm.
And then another concern is about the groundwater on the property can affect the health and safety of the residents and the environment, because it does say the institutional controls in the report are stated to protect human health and the environment by minimizing those activities that result in bringing groundwater to the surface to prohibit schools or other development of businesses if groundwater is present on the property. So has that recently been addressed too, or is that part of the blight study?
So that would not be a part of the blight study, ma'am. Once again, the blight study is going to look at certain conditions that are, once again, looking at it from the perspective of the 11 criteria. What I would say, what you are providing us tonight is more specific to the technical review and the assurance that are required by state and federal law. in which CDPHE and obviously EPA monitor on an annual basis and work with the property owner to ensure that, once again, the environmental covenants that are in place are being met with the approved materials recovery plan that is associated with that environmental covenant. So once again, those are two separate actions, two separate requirements pertaining to the property, or to, quite frankly, to the development of said property.
Well, it can, if you have that report, I mean, just so the mayor and city council has that report, I think, you know, if parts of that from the presentation were included in the PowerPoint, I think it is part of the presentation, and it isn't separate things, because from what I've seen, parts of that were cut and paste from that presentation, correct?
I did not cut and paste anything from that report, ma'am, but that said, I'd certainly be happy to send that out. And just a quick follow-up concerning the particular site we're looking at, there are 2 operational units right now, 6 overall, but 1 is for groundwater and 1 is for methane. Again, that's looking specifically at this area for redevelopment. And something that we could do in a future meeting is actually have CA Ventures environmental consultant come in and talk to the whole board or individual board members, because they're certainly more knowledgeable than we are, since they're the ones trying to develop the site and go through this process. But happy to send the EPA report out if that would be helpful for the board.
Yeah, thank you, because I do think it's hard for the mayor, council, and the other board members, you know, to get the whole perspective when we didn't even get the report before the presentation. And there is a lot of important other things that need to be discussed, like I said, especially with those explosions on the property and the groundwater. You know, I was just curious why that wasn't sent to us at a time, and parts of it is on the PowerPoint presentation. But I mean, I just hope that can be later on discussed and brought to the board as well. And like I said, the mayor and council, because there's a lot of environmental and health concerns too. Like I said, I realize the EPA and other agencies and the health department are involved, but the report is has some pretty important information, and it's 210 pages. So thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Board Member Hurst.
Yeah, I take a little perspective on the report, just because of some of the experience I have in a annual federal report. That's got to stay in. That history has to stay in, but there's no way it could have been removed from the Superfund National Registry without appropriate mitigation and continued progression in the levels of methane detected on site during 5-year reviews. So to get it off the Superfund site, they had to show that progression. And actually, a recent city council person, not on this city council, but was involved in one of the explosions in the 70s. And I've heard firsthand accounts, Mr. Teeter was involved in that. And so, you know, I've heard about all of that and the mitigation of the methane movement since then. And so to me, this is actually, in my opinion, a blessing that somebody's willing to take on this for long-term mitigation of the methane issue, continued assets being put towards the mitigation of that methane and not being checked once every 5 years. I really think this improves the situation for the area, because you are capping groundwater exposure with all of the layers that lead up to building, you know, asphalt and concrete and the surface that a business would use. And so it actually caps groundwater from, you know, or potentially contaminated groundwater from being exposed at the surface. And so I think a lot of the current issues come from an assessment of an open space. And this is the beginning, could be the beginning of triggering the processes that are necessary for the EPA and CDPHE to begin their assessment, which is now viewing a different perspective. It's an assessment of, can something be built here, and what are the what are the actions that are necessary to allow for development of this higher than normal risk site. And to me, I feel much more confident, you know, because this isn't approving a building. We don't have any authority or expertise in this exact type of analysis. And so, you know, funding a blight study to see where we're currently at in terms of building on this property in the future, and allowing the process for EPA and CDPHE to start to view this property with a different perspective really allows us to take steps forward that without this blight study and without interest in development, we would have continued to be in the dark, only utilizing that 210-page report that honestly probably started as a 50-page report and has been a lot of what was put in there, you know, 20 years ago is kept in there as historical reference, and then they just add the additional information from the 5-year review. And so the length of that report really comes from a lot of 5-year annual review or 5-year reviews. And so I'm comfortable with the blight study because it's the absolute, it doesn't move us anywhere but one step closer towards reviewing this overall project from being done. It could absolutely stop us from being able to move forward with any development on this as well, whether the blight study or the EPA and CDPHE study could completely kill this project. We just have yet to find out and need to allow that process to happen.
Board Member Noble.
Thank you. I just have questions. Is there anything else built on the 300+ acres of this former Superfund site?
Currently, the site is not developed. There's development surrounding the area, but not on the site itself.
Okay, so none of the 300 acres has anything on it.
No one has undertaken the extensive effort to development yet. You're correct.
Okay, and you mentioned that the current owner has violations on this site. Could you describe the violations and also whether who will bear the costs of fixing these violations? Correct.
Sure. Absolutely. So there are code compliance violations that have to do with dumping on the property itself, not within public right of way, et cetera. And that would be a cost that would be billed to the current property owner.
Okay, so it's nothing to do with the toxic nature at all. It's simply that people have been using it for dumping and the owner hasn't been removing them.
Yes,
material.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
One quick reminder, a significant portion of the overall site is in the city and county of Denver, and we are not dealing with that portion at all. We are only concentrating on the portion that's within Commerce City.
Though we are trying to work with Denver to clean up their portion.
Board Member Alan Thomas.
Yes, thank you. My just like I said, concern, I agree with the blight study, but I just feel like I said, even though in that report, that information, some of it should have been, like I said, still given to us. And even though it had to be included in the report and it happened over 20 years ago, it still can happen 20 years in the future or even today. So that's what I'm saying. We just need to make sure that it is going to be okay for the residents, the health, and anybody, even if it's an industrial site, that it's going to be safe for them due to the history of the property, because things can still occur on that property that previously had, even if the report does say it was 20 years ago. So I just wanted to add that, because history can repeat itself, and especially with the environment and affecting the health and safety of people that could be building industrial properties. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, ma'am. And just to your point, like I said, we will be required and are required by federal law and state law, as I said, with any application, if it be a development plan as what we've shown on the computer screen, to a grading permit, to a building permit. We are required to work very closely with the EPA and CDPHE at every turn to ensure that we are making sure that we are mitigating various, once again, impacts to the highest extent. So we will be working in lockstep with them along every single step of this process.
Okay, and doesn't it say in the report though that at one time everything had to be taken down from that property due to the chemicals at one time?
Once again, ma'am, I haven't dove deep into that report just because, once again, that's not necessarily my level of technical expertise. So I've relied heavily on EPA and CDPHE to guide us on what's been required on that site as it currently stands, what's required for them to meet as the current materials recovery plan. That is obviously in the nature of no vertical construction or development or any industrial development. Once they want to move forward with that, they will have to update that accordingly as far as their methane gas system accordingly with that, and as well their material recovery plan as well.
But to answer Councilwoman Noble's question, I'm not an expert, but if you read the report, it says things had to be moved from that property because of the chemicals on the property. It does state that in the report, and I'm not an expert, but it does say that.
Yes, ma'am. I think it is worth sharing, to your point. What we've come to also understand with the environmental covenant, it's also determinative of what the end use that the property owner wants to do with it, which will then determine how they are to mitigate the on-site effects. So once again, if somebody wants to simply take down buildings and not use it for any intended purpose, then obviously they would work closely with CDPHE and EPA on outlining what would be required of them if they want to go forward with I say an industrial development as what's being proposed. Then obviously they would work again with them on being able to demonstrate necessary requirements. So it's very determinative of what the property owner wants to do on said property about what actions have to occur.
Board Member Noble.
Are we in a position to ask for various mitigation as well on this property? I mean, I hear the concerns that that board member Alan Thomas is raising about health and safety, and certainly that's something that I've been concerned about as well. But there are multiple former Superfund sites in South Commerce City, and I think people are simply not aware of how many there actually are. And we have seen the effects of some of them from the former chemical plant. There was dioxane that got into the underwater streams. So it's really incumbent on us when we start messing with some of this property that we also put in measures that will ensure that we don't make the problem worse, or the people who are going to be taking over the property don't make the problem worse, because, you know, releasing methane into the atmosphere is not going to help either. So it's actually a very complicated site, and the fact that it's the one of the last ones to be developed tells us something about how difficult this particular site is as well.
Good question, ma'am. I would share that obviously any environmental conditions that we place would have to be coordinated effort with CDPHE and EPA, given that their environmental covenants, I would say, take prominent position, take priority position as it relates to mitigating the effects of any impacts from the capped landfill. So once again, we would work and obviously leverage their review and their, I would say, recommendations and or conditions as to being the environmental basis for the development going forward.
And again, the TIF funds are there for the mitigation as well as public improvements to streets like Ivy and 48th Avenue. But again, that's the reason they're asking for TIF, is for those mitigation costs to deal with the effects of the former landfill.
Board Member Madera.
I think the question that we need to be asking is, do we want to clean this up and be part of the solution? And I think, generally speaking, most of us do. And so I guess the question that we need to be asking staff is this the best way of, achieving those ends?
That's a great question, Councilmember Madera. I think what we quite frankly, what we have on our hands is a non-contributing asset to the community in a number of different ways, both from aesthetics, from character, and quite frankly, being able to once again have a change of perception in the area. You've heard Roger on a number of occasions, right? Illegal dumping and other aspects along this corridor has been a long-standing issue for us here at the city. And we are working effortlessly, as you hear earlier from Jenna, about trying to manage those activities of people dumping in the middle of the night and or leaving burnt out vehicles on the side of our streets. By being able to have a redeveloped site, from the intangibles, we're going to be able to have more eyes on the street, which is going to prevent people from wanting to illegally dump at a property. Now, to an actual contributing asset, being able to have a site that is providing both sales and use tax and property tax, and being able to also further the infrastructure needs in supporting not just this property, but adjoining properties that rely on that backbone is another significant benefit that cost is not then borne on the city and RICIPP, which we can then divert to other priority projects throughout the city because of that. Then at the same time, the metaphor as all boats will rise on that tide. So as that property develops, we will see other properties that are similarly situated in and around that area, leverage it as a catalytic opportunity to look at redevelopment or doing tenant improvements, which are only going to improve that character and that impression. So if you're thinking about an opportunistic site and really being able to turn a corner, and particularly for an area of the town that is a city that is truly in need of that kind of tenant loving care, this is a great opportunity for that. And being able to leverage urban renewal as that vehicle to, once again, taking something that's non-contributing and making it a truly high-level contributing asset.
And do you think we get there without a TIF or without making it a URA?
Quite frankly, I think if we don't leverage TIF, I think it's business as usual. We'll be out there every week trying to pick up illegal dumping, working with the existing property owner to clean up their property to the minimum standard necessary, where we've actually got a motivated developer who wants to come in and work hand in hand with the city to maximize it to the highest and best use, which is going to once again have some dovetail benefits to us as it relates to our city goal and our vision.
Thank you.
Board Member Boucher.
Jason Rogers, I couldn't have said it any better. I think I drive past this property every day, or at least 5 days a week. I think that we should go forward with the blight study. We have an active person that's interested in looking at cleaning up a site. And we're going to find out whether this is a property that could be redeveloped or not. If we find out it is, it will do only good things for that area. There is dumping that goes on in this area, not just on this site, but all over this area all the time, every day, every week. This is an incredible opportunity for us to do something with this property, and I think we should move forward to see if we can do something.
Any other comments or questions? Commissioner Tedesco.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Listen, I just have a question for staff. Can you summarize the ask of this board before we move forward? I just want to know, after all the questions and all the answers, what is the actual ask of the staff?
Sure thing, sir. So the actual ask is we are seeking permission to commission the procurement of an RFP to conduct a blight survey or a blight study, a county impact report, and to create the documentation for a urban renewal area formation.
And may I ask, does that, I just want to be sure I heard it correctly, that would involve negotiations with the county for the creation of the URA, correct?
That is correct. That and with other taxing entities as well that have a mill levy on the property.
Thank you, sir.
Roger, you're on mute, sir.
Sorry, thought I had unmuted. That would actually be the third step in the process. So the first step is securing the study.
So
Mr. Mayor, if I may, because now he confused me. So the negotiations with the county would not be the part of this ask, or it is?
It is as the third step. Jenna, do you mind going back to your slide that lays out those steps?
Not at all. I was actually working on that. So 1 minute, please.
So while Jen is doing that, like I said, we have 4 overall steps. We have the blight study as step 1. We have preparation of the county impact report as step 2. We have step 3, which is the negotiations with the taxing entities. And then step 4 being the formation of the urban renewal and the associated documentation with that. Once again, these steps can be done sequentially or can be done concurrently, once again, for timing purposes.
And what we're looking to do tonight is receive permission to submit the RFP to procure a contractor who would take care of all 4 of these steps for us. So while step 1 is the blight study, that same contractor under this same RFP would help us with negotiating with the taxing entities. And Caitlin, our attorney, is on the line and looks like her hand is raised.
Good evening, commissioners and Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add a piece. I would expect that after this first step of the RFP, we would likely be back before the board presenting the blight study, for example, presenting the condition, the impact report before those actual negotiations would take place. So just to provide those updates, so the approval tonight is really more related around the RFP to perform the work, and then we'd report back to the board.
Board Member Tedesco.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I would like to clarify what the permissions or the ask is so that everyone is clear about what we're allowing. I'm a little confused about on one hand, I had heard that we're approving all 4 steps. On the other hand, I heard we were approving the blight study. On the other hand, I heard we were approving hiring the law firm to do all 4 steps. So I would appreciate, if it's okay, to clarify what the ask is so that we know what we're approving tonight.
Yes, sir. I'm gonna go ahead and weigh in on that. So we have a request to issue a request for proposal. So a procurement process so that we can hire a vendor, a contractor that would perform the blight study, the county impact report, assist city staff, and participation with our outside legal counsel, which is Caitlin Conder, with her respective law firm. and perform and provide us with the urban renewal area plan for consideration by City Council to take a final action. As it relates to certain agreements and legal documentation, unfortunately, a vendor that we procure cannot provide that level of documentation, hence the use of Caitlin Conder and her law firm to assist us as staff and that vendor on those matters associated with those 4 steps.
Did that satisfy your question, Commissioner Tedesco?
Yes, Mayor, thank you very much, and I appreciate the clarification.
My pleasure, sir.
Are there any other questions or comments for staff regarding the presentation? Seeing none, I don't see here where we're actually taking a formal vote. Do you need a formal vote for us to authorize you to go forward? Yeah, okay, I'm looking for a motion in a second to authorize the city staff to create and distribute an RFP for the purpose of putting out a blight study for phase 1 of this. Did I cover everything I needed to with that, Mr. Tinkelberg, Mr. Rogers? Great. Board Member Hurst
So moved.
or Vice Chair Frank?
A second.
Great. I have a motion and a second to authorize the city staff to distribute an RFP and spend the money required to conduct a blight study for the purpose of potentially establishing an urban renewal authority at the area located generally at Ivy and 48th Avenue. Is there any discussion? Board Member Hurst?
Just about how I didn't put my hand down.
Seeing no requests for discussion, we will do a voice vote. So please give me a thumbs up in the window if you are in favor of this process moving forward. And looks like I have unanimous on that. So that passes and staff can move forward as needed. Are there any other items that you need the board to take action on regarding this item, Mr. Tingelberger, Mr. Rogers?
Yes, actually, if we could just have affirmation that we can proceed to continue using Caitlin Quander as our legal counsel.
Great. Looking for a motion and a second to continue the use of Caitlin Quander as our legal counsel for the Commerce City Urban Renewal Authority. Board Member Madera.
So moved.
Board Member Hurst.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to authorize the continued use of Caitlin Quander as the legal entity for the Commerce City Urban Renewal Authority. Is there any discussion? Seeing no request for discussion, we'll do a voice vote again. Please give me a thumbs up in the window. And that is also going to pass unanimously. Anything else you need on that, Mr. Tingelberg, Mr. Rogers?
No, sir.
No, great. Excuse me. We will move on to administrative business, which is an update on the Mile High Greyhound Park Hotel RFP. I'd like to invite Jason Rogers, Deputy City Manager, to give the update.
Thank you, Chair. Quickly wanted to give an update to the CCURA board in regards to our efforts with soliciting requests for proposals on our hotel site at MHGP. As you all know, the period in which submittals had to be made concluded last Monday, June 21st. On that date, by close of business, we had received 2 proposals for the potential development of a hotel on the location that's been identified. We as staff are still conducting an internal review of those proposals and conducting additional due diligence with both respondents on questions. That being said, we anticipate that we will be before you all on July 19th to bring those proposals forward for discussion and ultimately with recommendation as to next steps on being able to move forward with vertical development and approval for a hotel at MHGP.
Thank you for that update, sir. Does anybody on the board have any questions regarding the hotel RFP or the update provided by Mr. Rogers? Seeing none, that concludes all the business that we have for the Commerce City Urban Renewal Authority. Would like to thank all the board members who are not members of the City Council for your participation and for joining us this evening. Prior to adjourning, Mr. Tinklenberg, you have something to add? No? Okay. I saw you raising your hand, so I thought that you had something to add. So we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, board members, for your participation this evening. And we will see you probably on July 19th, I think, for another Urban Renewal Authority meeting to get a further update on that RFP process. And with that being done, I will give a 5-minute recess while we allow the board members to clear out before we start with the study session, give everybody a chance for a bio break. So we will convene the study session at 7:03. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started with our study session. Tonight we have two presentations. The first presentation is on the 2020 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. Would like to invite Cheryl Karstens, Director of Finance, to introduce the presentation.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor, members of council. I am here tonight along with Paul Kane, who is an audit partner with Eide Bailly. We are required to have an external firm conduct our annual audit. Eide Bailly staff was on site from April 19th through May 7th to review thousands of transactions from our financial statements, as well as reviewing hundreds of documents that they asked my staff to pull together for them. After they left the field work on May 7th, we continued to work with them remotely on wrapping up various items. A large portion of the financial statement audit was the audit of our federal awards. The largest program they looked at was our CARES funding. I'm happy to say they were very pleased with the information that was provided and the documentation that we put together for that. In the council communication, I indicated that there was a link to the full document that will continue to be available for anyone to review that throughout the years. We will also supply a hard copy to you. Once those are delivered, if you do not want to retain the hard copy, please feel free to return that to Annette Peters and she will make sure that is given back to the finance department. On Wednesday evening, I sent an email referenced AUC 260 communication. That is one of the items that Mr. Kane will be discussing with you. In addition, he will go over a couple of other documents that were included in the packet. The presentation will be displayed on the screen. I know via Zoom, it's hard to flip back and forth. So Mr. Kane will call out the document that he is referring to on which slides to hopefully make it easier for you to have those items in front of you. I'd like to take a minute to thank and recognize Teresa Wilson, my Deputy Finance Director. She was the main point of contact throughout the audit process. Eide Bailly staff was very complimentary of her efforts with that. She worked very diligently to get requests turned around by staff and back to them very quickly. So I wanted to acknowledge her efforts. I certainly appreciate the diligence she took during the audit process. We are required to submit our audit to the Office of the State Auditor by the end of July, which we will certainly meet. In addition to that, we will be submitting the financial statements as well as the popular annual financial report that Teresa is working on completing right now so that we can continue to compete for the GFOA awards, similar to the ones that we presented last week. So at this time, I am going to turn it over to Paul Kane from Eide Bailly. We are both available to answer questions throughout the presentation or at the end if you prefer to hold those questions until the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Good evening, Mayor, and good evening, Commissioners. Thank you for having me here tonight to present our audit results to you guys tonight. So I know we're starting a little later than the schedule, so I will try to make this as brief as possible to cover everything I think you guys need to hear. I'm going to echo Cheryl's thank yous. I think both Cheryl, Teresa, and their entire team were fantastic to work with this year. I mean, just to give you an idea of what an undertaking the city goes through to get an audit done. We're in the field for between being on site or working remotely over 6 weeks. We spent over 800 hours completing the audit and the single audit. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of time on their plates to help us answer our questions, provide information to us. And the entire time, they're so responsive and great to work with. So just want to say thank you for that as well before I get started. Also happy to report we had no blight encountered during our audit, so you won't have to worry about that in this presentation. I don't see the presentation. Is that, oh, right as I asked for it, look at that. So I will just say, next slide, I guess when I'm ready for it to turn. So next slide, please. Here's a brief agenda. We're going to go through just a little bit on the financial statement audit, our reports, just a little high-level financial results, the required communication that Cheryl mentioned that she emailed to you all last week, and then the single audit reporting package, which is our audit of your federal expenditures. Next slide, I'm going to start with the independent auditor's report. So the page numbers are a little wonky here. So this is page 11 of the CAFR, which is the 2020 CAFR draft in your packet. But we also put the independent auditor's letter 6/17/21 in your packet, which is a 3-page document. That is our opinion. That is what you pay us for. And that's what we're going to cover first. So this is a clean, unmodified opinion. This is really the very best you can receive. It's a 3-page report. I'm not going to go through the entire thing word for word, but just high level. There's a lot of paragraphs. Just what do they say? The first paragraph really just describes what we audited, which is the financial statements of the governmental business type activities of the city, the component units, each major fund, and the aggregate remaining fund information. And the second paragraph describes management's responsibility, which is for the fair and preparation and fair presentation of the financial statements. And then paragraphs 3 through 5 there on the first page describes our responsibility as auditors, which is to conduct our audits in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards, plan and perform the audit to obtain reasonable assurance, not absolute assurance, but reasonable assurance. And we did consider internal controls in consideration to designing our procedures, but we do not express an opinion on those controls. And we do believe that audit evidence obtained was sufficient to provide a basis for our opinion. Next slide, please. So the second page of the opinion, top paragraph is our opinion. This is the best you can get. It says that financial statements are fairly presented in all material respects in accordance with GAAP. Next, there's a paragraph that we call an emphasis of a matter paragraph, which that gets put in there when there's something that we want to emphasize. In this case, it was a restatement. So there were 3 restatements in the financial statements, 2 of which were the result of implementation of GASB 84. GASB is the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. 84 was the new standard, the 84th. It was effective this year. So in implementing that standard, there were 2 restatements that needed to be recorded to restate the beginning balances. So the financial statement started in line with what that standard says it should look like. And then there was a correcting entry that did affect a prior period related to the URF revenues, 2019 revenues recorded in 2020. So that pushed it back to 2019. Moving on, other matters. There's a section called other matters. This really talks about RSI, which is required supplementary information. That's not audited. This is your management discussion and analysis, as well as budget to actual schedules for your general fund and major special revenue funds. And then it goes on to other information, which we do give an in relation to opinion on. We don't audit it, but we look at it in relation to the stuff that we do audit, which is you're combining an individual non-major fund statements, the local highway finance report that's in the back. And then the third paragraph, or sorry, the third page is just other matters. There's introductory section and statistical information also in that document. We do not audit or provide any opinion on those 2 pieces of information. In the very last paragraph on the third page is just other reporting required by governmental auditing standards, generally accepted auditing standards, is GAS. And it just basically says that there are other reports we issued, which we'll talk about in our single audit report. And one other thing, the acronym CAFR, CAFR, you'll never see that again after tonight. GASB, actually the GFOA threw it out. It's actually a derogatory term in South Africa, or in Africa, not just South Africa, in Africa. So the word CAFR, CAFR is gone. It's now going to be called an ACFR going forward. So just so you know, you will never see that again after tonight. Maybe you will. It's probably going to be places, but we won't say it anymore. So going forward to the next slide, please. We're going to start digging into the financial position just at a high level. And in your packet, there's a 2020 MD&A link. This is the management discussion and analysis. This really in the CAFR document. This is page 15. And so when we refer to page 15 in the slides, it's page 1 of the 2020 MD&A link, but it's page 15 of the financial statement. So if you open that up, you'll see page 15 on the bottom of the first page of the PDF. Just high level, going to focus briefly on just financial position. I think it's important really to focus on MD&A because this is the only place in the financials where you'll see comparative information. So this year versus last year. It also, includes discussion from management, explaining what happened, why it happened, and things like that. This is probably the most informative 15 pages of your whole financial statement. Just a few highlights I wanted to pull out of the first page, really. So the city's assets and deferred outflows. exceeded the liabilities and deferred inflows by $370 million. So that's your net position. That's your really your retained earnings for those of you who understand private financial statements. Your net position is your retained earnings. And so that was 351 million last year, is 370 million this year. Overall fund balances at the end of 2020 increased 8.3 million from last year. And digging into the general fund, which is your operating fund of the city, unassigned fund balance of that fund was 62 million, which versus 55 last year. And this is 86% of your general fund expenditures. So really the unassigned fund balance in your general fund can cover 86% of a year's expenses, which is really awesome. And the fund balance of the general fund increased by 2.7 million this year, 3.3%. So the next slide is really focusing on page 17 of that packet, which is page 3 of the PDF. And it's a little table that says statement of net position, which is your balance sheet. So going into that, just looking at this year versus last year, that statement's the one, that page shows really what's this year look like versus last year. And compare, if you look at the bottom total, the far right column, you'll see that net position increased 17.9 million. So the 352.1 last year versus the 370 million this year. You went up almost 19 million during COVID, which is really fantastic. And so breaking down the components of that increase, really it was a couple of things. Your assets increased $12 million. If you look at the asset line, and the largest increase is in your current assets, and it's the result of an increase in cash and investments of 11 million. We're seeing that kind of across the board. I think a lot of spending kind of was sort of held back a little bit, and a lot of cash is just going up because you just wasn't sure what was going to happen this year. And so your cash investments increased 11 million. And total liabilities and deferred inflows went down 6 million, really due to the pay down of long-term liabilities, paying your debt payments and things like that. Didn't take on a lot of new liabilities, but you paid down 6 million of what was there last year. So the net of those two was like the main cause of the $17 million increase. And the next two bullets on this slide really highlight the fact that the vast majority of this increase was in governmental activities. So business type stayed really flat year over year with a $93,000 increase in business type. I refer to that, it's really just the solid waste management fund. Really consistent year over year in that fund. And looking a little closer at net position, you'll see your investment in capital assets is only 50% of your total net position. So it's really not spendable. It's what have you invested in your assets less your debt, what percentage of that is of your net position. We'll see that up to 70 or 80% in some of our governments. So I mean, 50% of your net position is not capital assets, I think is really good. Jumping forward to the next slide. I pulled these tables out of your MD&A as well. I think they're really good. I typically put things like this in presentations because it's good to see this trend. The first table is a pie chart and it shows the components of your balance sheet. Here's a statement of net position. You'll see the current assets. I think the thing to point out here is that it's small, but it's a 16%, and your current liabilities are only at 2%. So essentially your current ratio is over 8-to-1. So your current assets are large enough really to pay for your current liabilities 8 times. They're pretty darn good position there. You'll see there's a line that's kind of separates this chart right down the middle, showing your assets equal your liability and net position is kind of how that's broken out. That's kind of the one key thing to pull out of that pie chart for me. But then the total net position, seeing that trend is really good. I think just to discuss that over the last 10 years and the continual improvements noted here. So even through the pandemic, if you look at this chart, you can see the decline through 2013 and then 2014 all the way through 2020, your net position jumped from 241 million up to 370 million over the last 7 years. So it just shows a really strong commitment to budget, growing your net position and just making sure you have a solid financial cushion going forward. Next slide, I'm going to just briefly discuss how did your net position go up $18 million, and really, in relation to last year where it went up 23 million. So the differences between this year and last year is what I'm kind of going to relate to here. So looking at revenues in 2020 versus 2019, the revenues increased about $5 million. And really, this is basically the money you received from COVID. federal funding. So the CRF funds, coronavirus relief funding, $4.6 million was provided to the city from Adams County. And that was essentially the increase in your revenues. Some things went up and some things went down, but that 4.7 million is your CRF funds. And then your expenses actually increased from last year by 10 million. So revenues went up 5 million, expenses went up 10 million. So that's why your net income dropped 5 million from last year. But the increase in expenses, one was the $5 million in coronavirus relief funds. You got it out there. I mean, you gave it to food banks and nonprofits and small businesses and everything in between. I think you guys had, 10 different, seemed like 10 different programs, different things to use that money for, which was really commendable compared to what I've seen with some of my other clients. It was really great to see how you took that money and really engaged in the community in so many different ways. And we audited that program, which I will talk about in a little while. I think that's really all I wanted to talk about on this slide. So that's it for the financial results. I'm going to go through the governance letter really quick and then give a moment for questions on the financial statements. So I'll pause here for questions if anybody has questions on the financial statements.
Are there any questions at this time from council? Seeing none, please proceed.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so this is the AU 260 communication that Cheryl sent out via email last week. This is really a form letter that we start with. Audit standards require us to communicate with governance, which is in your city, it's the city council, it's management, it's mayor, it's all of you. And so this letter, really, I broke it down into 5 bullets, what we're saying within this letter. We did comply with the professional standards, including all ethical requirements when performing our audit. There were no significant accounting policies adopted during 2020. And the financial statements do include some sensitive disclosures because of their importance to users of financial statements, which we identify which disclosures those are within that letter. There were corrected and uncorrected misstatements identified during the audit, which we spell out in that letter. And there were no disagreements or significant difficulties with management that we encountered during the audit. Next slide, please. This I threw in here to show you guys just the upcoming GASB implementations coming down the line. So Governmental Accounting Standards Board is really busy, which means that we're all really busy trying to get this stuff implemented. And so this year was GASB 84. We mentioned that earlier. It's called fiduciary activities. It changed 15-second high-level summary. It changed the reporting related to fiduciary activities. It pulled those statements from the back to the front. It changed the way net position gets reported, and it changed the definition of what a fiduciary activity is. So your financial statements were changed to pull out the police pension fund, which was no longer a fiduciary fund per the new definition. And it reclassified liability to net position, or the 2 restatements that happened as a result of implementing that standard. And just looking ahead, so leases are 2022, which is a massive undertaking for every single government, and it will be for you as well. So there's really nothing that significant in 2021, but that's to give governments time to deal with leases. And we can talk about that if anybody has specific questions on what that means. There's tons out there if you want to Google GASB 87 and really get an idea of the impact on your government. Okay, moving forward is my question slide. So we can skip the next 2. And I'm going to dig into the single audit a little bit. So the single audit was a separate attachment as well in your agenda. It was entitled CCC Single Audit Report. And what the single audit is our audit. It's a separate audit. It's a separate report that we issue over your federal expenditures. And the first 3-5 pages it's 2 separate reports. And then there's some more information. I'll briefly go through what's all included in this report. So the report on financial statement internal controls is first. This is page 3 of the PDF document. And it's not an opinion. The main thing to get out of this report, it basically says that we are required to consider internal controls for planning and performing our audit. However, we don't test those controls and we don't express an opinion on those controls. We also talked through that letter about what is a significant deficiency, what is a material weakness, and we were required to communicate any deficiencies that we identified during our audit. And we did have one material weakness, and that is reported as 2020-001. And so this is in comparison to last year, we had 2 financial statement issues and one compliance issue. So went from 3 last year to 1 this year. Let's see, and then the next, if you want to go to the next slide, please. Uniform guidance report starts on page 5 of the PDF. And this is our opinion over compliance related to your major programs. So we go through, look at all your federal expenditures. A major program is a program that we identified as one we needed to audit this year. The first paragraph here states that we audited compliance with OMB's office, whatever that stands for, management budget or something, compliance supplement. This compliance supplement is what drives what we have to audit. And we note that you can find the programs we identify as major in the summary of auditor's results section, which is on page 8. And this year, the only program that was major was your CRF, Coronavirus Relief Fund. And the next 2 paragraphs describe management and our responsibility as auditors, and notes that we believe that our audit provides reasonable basis for our unqualified opinion. So we do have an unqualified, unmodified, clean opinion on the program that we tested. So that can be qualified if we have significant findings over the program. And as Cheryl said, the documentation Teresa maintained over the spending over this program was second to none. There was memos and just everything was there. Everything we needed was in a massive file. It was very organized. And I mean, just what you guys did with the money was fantastic. So after these opinions, we do include a report saying we considered controls over compliance to determine our testing procedures, and we did not identify any deficiencies in controls over compliance with your major programs. And again, to point out, there was one finding in prior year, which was corrected this year and is noted no findings in the current year related to our audit. Okay, next slide, please. I'm almost done. The next page, which is page 8 of the PDF, is your CFA, which stands for Summary Expenditures of Federal Awards. And so summary of annual federal expenditures is really what this is. It details all the federal expenditures of the government during 2020, which I've outlined on this slide was 6.2 million this year compared to 1.7 last year, under 750 the year before. So no single audit if it's under $750,000. And the big change this year was the CRF funds. So expenditures were pretty consistent year over year, other than now you had 4.6 million more related to COVID-19 CARES Act funding. The next slide is just the summary of our auditor's results. This is another page within the single audit report. It just details yes or no questions on some specific questions related to our audit. We did have material weakness, no other findings, no compliance issues, unmodified opinion. It details what program we audited, coronavirus, COVID-19 CARES Act funding, and basically what threshold was used to determine a major program, which was $750,000 this year. Next slide is the last slide, and it just details the findings. We did have one finding, and as I said, this was a financial statement finding. Really, it was the material weakness simply due to the fact that it was a material audit adjustment that we had to post. And it's hard to not write a material weakness when the adjustment is a material amount. So that's really why it ended up being material weakness. It was related to revenue recognition of the Derby sales taxes. Management actually revised revenue recognition policies in light of last year's finding and made sure there's been a timing issue with this revenue stream for several years. Until the 2019 revenue was recorded in 2020, and the 2020 revenue, when management looked back at all these streams from last year's finding, realized that the 2020 revenue needed to be put in 2020, but the result was the 2019 revenue was also in 2020, and it wasn't pushed backwards. So this restatement that we talked about earlier and this material audit adjustment was to take the 2019 revenue that was in 2020 and push it back against fund balance, as it was a 2019 revenue item. And that was the material adjustment. There were 3 other past adjustments that were not material that we have to, if there's a pass adjustment, typically there's a control efficiency associated with it that resulted in the adjustment needing to be passed on in the first place. So pass adjustment means that they're not material. It's up to management if they want to record them or not. We discussed these. Management elected to pass on adjusting the financial statements for these 3 items. They are all related revenue recognition issues, and so they were lumped together with the material weakness adjustment as well. And so that's the kind of extent of the finding. Just to point out, it did come out of management extra work and what they did last year in adjusting, implementing new policies to find new to properly state revenue from the issue from last year. It was just that one piece was to push the 2020 piece back to 2019 that didn't happen. So I feel good about the way things are set going forward. Management agrees with the finding, and they are working on the corrective action as we speak. And I think that is my last slide. So any other questions for Cheryl or I?
Are there any questions or comments from council? Seeing none, would like to thank you for all your work on the audit, as well as thank the finance team for all the work in keeping everything squared away as you have done once again year after year. And the financial position of the city looks to be very strong, and that's due to some effective management from the top. So thank you very much, Mr. Tinklenberg, and all your members of your management staff for doing well to keep us going in the right direction. And we will move on to the next presentation, which is going to be a residential fence height discussion. Would like to invite Jason Rogers, Deputy City Manager, to make the presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. Jordan, if you do not mind kind of bringing up the presentation and running that for me. Thank you, sir. So first off, good evening, Mayor and City Council. Tonight, I'm going to be taking us through various topic discussions as it relates to fencing and fence height regulations. Jordan, if we can move to the next slide. Obviously, more specifically, the goal at the end of our discussion that I would like for us to try to achieve, or I would like to try to achieve for your consumption and discussion and ultimately consideration is the aesthetic and safety intent behind our regulations, regulatory comparisons as it relies or as it applies to fencing and height restrictions. And then obviously, once again, opportunities and constraints for modification within our current environment. Next slide, Jordan. Here's just a general kind of background of the topic areas that we're going to touch on tonight. Next slide. Next slide. So background. Fencing with the growth of our residential and productive home development by merchant home builders and various desires from residents for safety, protection of property, or just general aesthetics. Fencing has become more customary as we start to see development, more and more so. Just some numbers for you. Last year in 2020, we had 473 fence permits that were sorry about that, having some camera issues. But what you can see here on the screen is what applies to fencing, where it applies to generally within our incorporated boundaries, interior lots and corner lots. Next slide. So the 4 bullet points that you see on the screen are really guiding principles as it relates to fencing. Later on in this presentation, we're going to discuss the role of the city, but what this really conveys is that fencing is truly driven by our development community as it relates to wanting to have something that is attractive and easy to maintain, that is consistent, to create a certain level of cultural characteristics for their project, to have it stand alone and apart from others. And that what we've started to see is that the next level is that you may find HOAs that may be more restrictive in fencing requirements within their own CCRs. So we try to navigate all of that from our respective role in being able to ensure that, once again, we have cohesive design that is stitching various communities into our community, but knowing that at sometimes it can be somewhat complex. Next slide, please. So for a brief moment, I do want to talk about the types of fences, and there are two predominant styles of fencing that are found in Commerce City. We have a screen style and an open style. What you find on this slide is a screen style, which is one with an opaque surface. So your common cedar plank shiplap construction. Next slide. And obviously the other type of style is our open style, which really provides visibility through the fence, or as we like to think about it, eyes on the street. And there are various types that range from open rail to split rail to chain link to wrought iron. Next slide. Once again, this is just a conveyance of other type of styles within the open style type of fencing. Next slide. So additional background for the city. Well, the city began regulating fences in 1975. This is in support of, I would say, more traditional regulatory standards and practices. This is slightly after the formation of the Community Development Department, where those efforts initially were initiated for development of a comp plan and to a land development code, which obviously identifies various bulk, dimensional, and performance standards and/or design standards in which you find fencing. In 2003, adjustments were made to allow for a 5-foot tall fence on corner lots to give greater flexibility for residents. Then obviously with the most recent change occurring in 2018 to allow even more flexibility as it relates to design and height on corner lots. So those are probably the most significant aspects of changes to our fencing standards over the history of the city. Next slide, please. So I wanted to particularly spend a little bit of time based on, I would say, the discussion and the queries we heard from council on the 7th of June around open styling fencing. As we noted earlier, as I noted earlier, right, the intent of fencing in particular with open style is driven, while yes, towards aesthetics, but it also has some safety and general welfare factors that come into play in a number of different ways as well. Next slide. What we also thought was worth sharing as we talk about open style fencing is also the relationship between the public and the private realm, which conveys both a physical and a psychological representation of height. So in that first bullet point, sub-bullet, right, what we're talking about with the foundation of a house being constructed at a higher elevation than the property line. One, it's in order to allow, obviously, those properties to be able to drain properly, but at that same time, relatively on the opposite side of the fence, which is going to be built at a lower level, it's going to demonstrate a taller fence. So, right, physical environment, gonna have that representation, but also psychologically, as you walk by that fence and as you step further back, it also creates a higher fence, which then conveys a sense of of protection, safety, and just general welfare as well. Next slide. So continuing along that theme of safety, one thing that we do not highlight, but our standards and regulations indirectly support, is leveraging community policing through environmental design, or CEPTED design. And CEPTED really focuses on changing how places are laid out, how the look and the feel of certain amenities and or techniques with landscaping and buildings are leveraged to prevent crime and to minimize the perception of fear of certain aspects. So where you find the majority of our open style fences are along sight triangles, are along areas of where we want streets, eyes on streets and parks and open space for protection of children and the elderly, to be able to make various aspects of our community more welcoming rather than a closed off style, and to kind of avoid fence canyons, which once again, for certain aspects of trails aren't lit or open spaces aren't lit, once again, it makes it more inviting for those who want to traverse those areas with a sense, and knowing that they have that additional support and protection as well. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to pause for a moment if there's any questions that council may have of me so far through this presentation.
Are there any questions at this time? Seeing none, please proceed.
Thanks, sir. Current zoning regulations, next slide. So fences are governed by several regulatory practices. The primary practice being the three buckets that you see here on screen, right? The Land Development Code, PUD Zone Doc, or a Planned Unit Development Permit and Landscape Plan process. What I think is a key kind of takeaway is that these are, with respect to PUD districts and the associated process, they're individualized and heavily driven by the developer and the applicant. Right, going back to the aesthetics guiding principle earlier in this presentation. Next slide. This slide covers the regulatory requirement for both interior and exterior lots for our current land development code requirements. So you find what is the height maximum for both your front, your rear yard, your side yard, interior, but also for your corner lot and your street effect and next to open space or parks. One thing I did want to share with you is that what we do allow within our code, which is somewhat different, is a shadow box, which is an alternating kind of design that we consider to be an open style, which if you're on a corner lot, we would consider that shadow box design to be open style, which will allow it to go from a 5-foot height requirement to being 6 feet to allow for that. Next slide. This slide here as well covers the type of style of fences for both interior and corner lots. Next slide. So now I want to jump into the next 4 slides that provides examples of the diversified approach of based on the community itself. And before kind of going through those very buckets, I think the key thing that as my staff and I were looking at this is that each neighborhood has their own standard. What you'll find in the packet materials is also a subdivision map, just for your reference, if wanting to go back and take a look at this after the meeting. But if you notice in that subdivision, we have 36 residential PUDs, and only from a handful of the subset that we looked at, right? We didn't go through all of them, but we looked at enough to understand that, right? There's a number of them that do it differently for the intended purpose at the time in which the developer came in wanting to accomplish their vision for that particular community. So what you find here on this slide is that some of our planned unit developments regulate fencing through the actual rezone document itself. They don't rely on a PUD permit or a landscape plan. They rely simply on, here's the standard, this is what needs to be applied. And then resident, you may apply, if not applied for by the developer, for a fence permit from the city. And these are examples of the communities that in the Northern Range exemplify this type of regulatory practice. Next slide. What you'll find, thank you. What you'll find is that some PUDs will take it to another level in which they will have it be described and approved and defined within the planned unit development permit or landscape plan. So in this instance, the planned unit development zone doc does not speak of a requirement, but will rely on the PUD permit and the landscape plan to define whether or not the land development code standard is applicable or if a particular type of design will take precedence. And you see examples here that range from Bell Creek to River Run that leverage this form of regulatory practice. Next slide. Now there is, some that are somewhat interesting in a kind of a hybrid approach. We have some PUDs that will regulate fencing as part of their zone doc. So for instance, 4-foot fencing along parks and open space. But they will then take another turn and regulate the interior and corner lots through their approved development permit and or landscape plan for individual lots. And we have those examples from Potomac Farms and Frontier. So, right, you start to see here that, right, we've got a lot of mishmash of different approaches and types that we are trying to regulate and trying to track and trying to ensure compliance with from what was presented by the developer at time of initial approval. Next, please. And then lastly, for properties that are non-PUD, so right, think your core historic city, smaller residential developments up north that are able to demonstrate that they can meet the basic bulk dimensional standards without having to go through a definitive process with the PUD. They will be heavily reliant upon the land development code standards that was represented to you all earlier in the night's presentation. Next slide, please. And before jumping into that, there's one thing that we really didn't talk about is a external variable that we have no ability to control, is when we see HOAs or metro districts further restrict and or constrain the type of fencing within their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, right? And decide to include be more restrictive and not less. So just want to throw that out there for you all as well. As it pertains to fencing over 6 feet in height, how do we address that? What do we look at? So with respect to when it looks at the interface of residential to non-residential to mitigate various nuisance conditions, a fence is allowed to go up to 8 feet. Now that fence has to be proposed by the non-residential development in order for that condition to be met. We do, in certain instances, allow for a taller fence when we're looking at the perimeter fence of a subdivision to go from 6 feet to 8 feet. And typical conditions that we'll find out adjacent to our collector or arterial roadways that have obviously certain noise and other impacts that we want to be able to mitigate on the residential for the benefit and the use of their property. With respect to when we're looking at, and I believe it was brought up on the 7th, of the fencing types between adjoining residential. So let's say single family dwelling residential to multifamily. We do not define or an allowance of additional height between those two uses because we typically don't get to that level of detail with adjoining uses. Now, that's not to say that we couldn't in looking at other regulatory practice that provides, I'll say, a greater buffer or mitigation. When you think of multifamily, you're thinking 3-4 stories in height. And quite frankly, there's not really a fence that's going to be that tall adjacent to a single family residential residence that's going to be able to mitigate that. So you start to look at other regulatory practices where you start to stair step buildings back adjacent to lower intensity residential to once again to remove that impact and to remove that view shed. That's obviously something that we can look at as we go forward when it comes to those type of inferences. Next slide, please. So role of CD when it comes to fence heights. So over the next 2 slides, I want to dig into what is our responsibility as staff. And really, as the slide denotes, the developer and the builder proposed the fencing as part of the PUD permit, part of the PUD zone dot. And quite frankly, as we've started to see a lot of this differentiation in the type of fencing with PUD zone dot submittals and just the permit themselves, we've actually tried to encourage fencing to remain in lockstep with our land development code. Once again, it's an easier practice to be able to manage, be able to enforce, and being able to help our residents navigate because of some of the processes that we have available to it within the land development code. Next slide, please. That being said, outside the establishment of the regulations that are really driven by both builders and developers, we really only get involved after the initial approval at the time of building permit. A building permit is required for any fence that's over 42 inches, and that's per the building code, not the land development code. So as we review that against the PUD, the PUD permit, and the LDC, that's where we provide those comments back to it being the applicant, it being the contractor that's going to be putting the fencing up, and where that requirement of them having to demonstrate compliance with that requirement. That being said, I will share with you, my staff and I have toiled over this over the last couple of years as to what is the benefit of truly reviewing fence permits here in the city. And what will be coming forward to the council in Q3 of this year is a building code amendment to remove the requirement of fencing, so that once again, it will be a self-governed effect by property owners in how they move forward with the erection of that fence. Fences over 6 feet in height due to snow load and wind loads will still have to be reviewed, because obviously that's for just general safety and welfare. But for those fences that are between 4 and 6 feet, based on our review, once again, I would say that we have 150 fences that were submitted for this year. I highly doubt that that is the full complement of fences that are being erected here in the city by pulling of a permit. So once again, as we look at that and as we start to see where our priorities with growth and development occurring here in the city, and knowing quite frankly, this is truly a civil matter between two private property owners of how they would like to erect their fence along and around their property edge, it doesn't seem appropriate for us as staff to be in the middle of that process. And at the same time, the amount in which we are charging for a fence permit, which ranges somewhere between $23 to $100 based on valuation of the work, isn't recouping the amount of time and hours of effort that multiple staff across multiple divisions are putting into this, to where once again, we can better divest that time and once again, be able to have it be specifically onto the matters that are really driving the growth and development here in the city. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions with relation to the information that I just went over.
Are there any questions from council at this time? Councilmember Noble.
I have a lot of questions, actually. The 3 slides that you went through on community comparisons, I think it would be really helpful if this wasn't done in planning department lingo and spelled out a little bit more clearly for us. Because how you define a PUD versus how a layperson defines a PUD can be quite different. In addition, you indicated on the slides that some fell into one category and some neighborhoods fell into another category and others fell into a different category, and I'm ignoring the non-PUDs at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And now the city is saying, oh, even though we approve those, we're going to punt. We're not going to get involved in fencing requirements anymore. It's our approval, but it's your problem. And I don't understand how that's working. So it's like 2 questions. One is to go through those 3 slides again. And the second is, I don't see how the city can walk away and just say, oh, well, do what you want, as long as you meet the city standards.
So thanks for those questions, ma'am. I'm going to go back to your first one. I need to better appreciate and understand the definition of, I would say, your perspective on the definition of planned unit development. I would only say that there's in not necessarily planning lingo, but how we've defined it by our code and our regulations of what a planned unit development is and what it prescribes and what it allows. So I just need to better understand where you're going with that aspect so that I can respond to that question. And
Okay, I think it would be best then to go back to the slides.
Sure thing.
The 3 slides about the communities.
Sure thing, ma'am.
Community, yeah. Okay, and then one more back. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So that's the first one.
Mm-hmm.
So it says some PUDs regulate fencing by the PUD zone document. Who has authority over the PUD zone document? In this case, how are you defining a PUD?
So a planned unit development is a rezone application, obviously, that receives final decision-making by city council. For an example, when you all heard the Legato PUD zone doc, that PUD zone doc in that presentation that was made to the council outlined what were the allowable land uses on various aspects of the property. It identified the roadway infrastructure. It identified other various bulk and dimensional standards that would then become the zoning powers and authority document for vertical construction. So that is a PUD zone doc, which ultimately receives council's, once again, approval or denial when it's heard before you.
So in this particular case, for these 4 communities, a city council approved the PUD zone document that had regulations for fencing within the document.
That is correct, ma'am.
Okay, then next slide. And then how does this differ? In this case, the PUD development permit or landscape plan, it is not the PUD zone document.
That is correct, ma'am. So your PUD zone document establishes the rules of the road for vertical development or vertical construction, whereas your PUD development permit and landscape plan is the entitlement approval that effectuates it. So it shows the lots, it shows the streets, it shows the landscaping, it shows a heightened level of technical detail on the plans of what's being approved to show conformance with the PUD zone document language. So while the PUD zone doc may be silent, or the PUD zone doc may have language, it's truly then the developer has taken another step of then showing those details within the permit itself as well. So having it in 2 locations.
Okay, so did these already have it included in their zone documents, or did they not do it in the zone documents and instead they used the PUD development permit or landscape plan to regulate fencing?
They did it in both places, ma'am.
Okay, so this is an add-on.
Yes, ma'am.
So in this case, then again, a city council approved the fencing regulation for all of these communities because they approved the zone document, which included the development permit and the landscape plan.
So the development permit and the landscape plan would have been approved administratively, but yes, the PUD zone doc would have been approved by council at time of consideration, of initial consideration and approval for that community.
And who has authority over the development permit, conformance, etc.?
That would be administrative. So that would be the city staff.
Okay, and then the next slide then. Okay, so this one says both of these things.
Correct.
For these 4 neighborhoods, 4 communities, or Frontera 1 and 2 and 3.
Correct. So what this shows is somewhat of a hybrid. Once again, the PUD zone doc, in this case, or in these cases, spelled out the regulation for fencing along open space and parks, whereas the PUD permit then further regulated the type of fencing that could be for interior and corner lots, which is separate and apart or different.
And up until this point, how many years has the city been the permit authority on fencing? For how many years has the city been doing that?
That's a good question, ma'am. I don't have that off the top of my head. I know we have the planning manager on the line as well. He may have some history as to when we were having, and I'm trying to bifurcate the process, right? We have the entitlement process and we have the permitting process, which is the building division with a building permit. So just for clarity, which one are you speaking about, ma'am?
Well, I think my issue is this. What this doesn't define is whether these fencing regulations are in the CCNRs of these various communities. Then we have layered on top of them the metro districts. Is it in some of, or the HOAs included in the HOA CCNRs, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then we have the metro districts that might have I guess they wouldn't include that, would they, in a metro district? But then you have the zone documents and the development permits or landscape plans that the city and a city council approved. And we get into this issue of either total chaos or no one regulating or everyone finger pointing. And now we're talking about the city, which has been regulating, stepping out of it.
So allow me to try to walk through your thoughts and your comments, ma'am. So one, when it comes to HOA or metro districts, that is separate and apart from our process. We have no bearing, we have no ability to affect. That is by an HOA, that is by a metro district. They have the ability, if they so choose, to further restrict through their conditions, covenants, and restrictions. But we have no ability to affect that. The only thing that we can affect and that they cannot subjugate is they cannot make our requirements less intensive, but they can make requirements more intensive if they so choose. A prime example being, we allow greater flexibility for fencing within the Reunion PUD. However, the Metro District and the HOA have taken a position to be more restrictive than what is allowed by the regulatory and zoning powers of the city. And they are permitted to do such. So we don't have a bearing on what each HOA or Metro District has chosen to enforce within its CCRs as it relates to fencing. But we do know that some have taken a step of being more restrictive than others. As to your effect about the decision-making process, once again, the council makes the decision on the PUD zone doc. Once again, setting the standards, setting the rails, right, the roadmap. Whereas the implementation tool, the establishment and the effectuation of that roadmap is the development permit and the landscape plan, which is approved administratively. Once again, that's getting into the technical details on the ground. As it relates to, I think you used words earlier of punting or stepping out of enforcement and assurance that the rules are being met. I would say that the process in which we are not requiring a level of heightened review is that building permit. The local authority, the establishment of fence requirements, the assurance of having met those will still be captured in the appropriate location, either in a PUD zone doc through specificity as to what they would allow or will not allow, or a reference back to the land development code, or through the prescriptive nature of the development permit in the landscape plan as they're seeking to approve individual filings. So the absence of a permit isn't the absence of enforcement. Hence again, let's say my neighbor calls code enforcement to say, hey, I think Jason is building a fence as tall as he is. Well, that is outside of the code requirement. So then code enforcement would then have the ability to still enforce on the requirements that were established within the zoning or within the land development code. So there is still an effect that we play. It's simply the permitting process, which is a heightened level, is once again something that we have viewed that doesn't necessarily serve the ultimate end goal of allowing and moving fencing forward for various practices, as I enumerated earlier. But we are still going to have a touch point when it comes to fencing.
I was told, I'm sure Mr. Sheasley is on the line here also, that if a resident wanted to challenge fence heights, which was an issue in the Reunion area in particular, there's been far more discussion there than I've seen in other of these communities, is that they would take it to the city, and then if they were turned down by the city, then they could appeal to the city council, and at which point there would be a decision made at that level. So you're suggesting though that we will, the concept for Q3 is to take the city and the city council out of the decision-making on any challenges to fence heights within these PUDs.
No, ma'am. I'm simply taking out the building permit process, which is administrative, ministerial, which looks at the physical construction of the fence, not necessarily the regulatory requirements and or the entitlement thereof. So that would still remain.
Okay. All right. I get it. Thank you very much for allowing me to ask so many questions, but it is a particular interest in this area, and since there is somewhat of a lack of consistency in the Reunion area as well. There's some 4-foot fences, there's some 6 foot, there's some that are open, there's some that aren't. It is inconsistent. So
I appreciate that, ma'am. I will share with you, the next portion of the presentation will get to potential relief mechanisms that are available and our recommendations kind of as going forward. So.
All right, thank you. And I apologize if I jumped the gun. Thank you so much.
No worries, my pleasure.
Councilmember Hurst.
Thanks for the presentation, and I appreciate everybody's willingness to take on this topic in a pretty timely manner. Just wanted to kind of follow up as to why I asked for this topic to be discussed. And I appreciate all of the obstacles being put on the table. This is kind of what I was asking for. I'm gonna be pretty quick about it so everybody can say something and we can move on. But I would just ask that we remove the city permit requirement as suggested, as long as it meets a basic set of standards. And one of the things that I would suggest is, I'm not asking for the metro districts or HOAs or those combinations thereof to not have the same control they have today. But I would like it to be, Commerce City's fence standard is between 4 and 6 feet tall. We have stipulations about screen and open fencing. And as long as they meet within those standards, we won't regulate any further than that, right? Of course, 8-foot fence, we're back into that regulatory role. Would have to be approved for that through that same standard. But most residential fences are between 4 and 6 feet. One of the arguments that I would make for that, just basic standard, is our vicious animal legislation that was passed recently. I really feel like if you're on a corner lot, we're putting you in a hard place. A lot of residential HOAs and metro districts do not allow for dog runs, or outdoor dog kennels that are permanently affixed. And if they do, they're not so easily approved and not always in the location that is desired by the homeowner. And so without that, and I'm not not necessarily saying that's a better solution by putting your dog inside of a caged location, but without that, we really are saying if you're a corner lot homeowner, it's not a good idea to have an athletic animal in your backyard as a pet. Just meaning a lot of athletic dogs can jump a 4-foot fence without a thought. And so dogs will be dogs. You can have the nicest family dog out there, and defending their property from someone, harmlessly walking by can happen. And so want to try to avoid that. One of the things I do want to make clear though is there's two sides to the 4 to 6 foot. I would also like us to approve screen fencing similar to the wood fence that we saw in the presentation, on corner lots, as long as it doesn't go beyond the house. So if you're going to have a front yard fence enclosing your front yard, that needs to be open with a 4-foot maximum. I would be willing to keep that type of regulation for the same safety purposes that were outlined in the presentation. But if the fence, like a lot of standard houses, does not go beyond the house line, the front of the house, it's not impeding any additional viewpoint from a safety perspective, because the house is actually what's impeding the view and not the fence. And so because the house stands, at least 6 feet taller than the fence line. And so similar to a lot of residential neighborhoods, the house or the fence line stops between 4 and 6 feet behind the front of the house line. And with that being said, as long as that's the same case on the corner lot, I don't see why having a variable fence height should not be permitted from a screen option as well. And then I think the last thing is I think our code could say something along the lines, and obviously this is not the legal jargon that would be used, but the first cycle must comply with the standards set out by the developer. And that is for kind of uniform look and ability to kind of build and deliver a product that they set out to do. So what I mean by that is, if you're an initial home buyer, I don't know what the first cycle would really be. Is that 10 to 12 years or 7 to 10 years? But within that first cycle of fencing, within a reasonable amount of time for a fence to, be up and stay there strong, not have to replace by the homeowner, you do have to comply with that. But beyond that, once the community matures, then we move into this, non-regulatory stance from the city's perspective, and we allow for that 4 to 6 foot variance with the local democratic process for the HOA or metro districts overriding the city's minimum standard where that local community sees fit. But if that local community says just meet the city's basic standard of between 4 and 6 feet and meet the style standards based off of your property, I would like to see the city completely not remove ourselves from regulation. I do understand the dangers of that, but remove ourselves from being involved in anything inside those parameters. It really allows for even further localized government. If we're going to continue to require HOAs and or metro districts in all new development, this really gives the opportunity for that localized democratic process to play in itself and make people decide what type of community fencing they want to have within their own smaller localized communities. And so I don't know that there's a clean way to get there. What I'm requesting, I guess, out of my comments is the legal process of changing PUDs and CCNRs and all of that would take so much time and resources that it seems to me that we've kind of put ourselves in a situation where that's almost undoable. Just for sanity's sake and for asset management's sake. But is there a legal process that allows us to take that similar type of position, as long as everybody would, vote and agree to that, without having to go through individual changes, all the PUDs and CCNRs and all the stuff that's been approved over the last 20 years on city council as the developments have continued to happen up north? Is there a cleaner way for us to do something like that?
So if I may interrupt, Mayor, very good questions, Councilmember Hurst. I think I would say two slides in the next portion, I think provide some of the relief mechanisms of what you're trying to accomplish,
Right.
Without the going down the rabbit hole of the PUD, the land development code, the PUD permits, and quite frankly, the complexities that are situated around each one of those three big buckets. So I think we already have those mechanisms in place to give that that flexibility. So Jordan, if you can pull up the PowerPoint again. And move on to the minor modification slide. So once again, after initial development of approval, we have relief mechanisms that individual property owners, HOAs, metro districts, or developers can come in to seek modification or changes. And what we see primarily, because the last true change of any of the requirements or relief was in 2017 by River Run, by the River Run HOA. So we haven't seen many, quite frankly, large development or large community representation come in because of those various complexities that you notated. So what we've seen, quite frankly, it's been more of the process that's been leveraged through A and B, the minor modification and the variance. So Jordan, if you can go to the next slide, please. With minor modifications, LDC, PUDs include typical language that allows for a minor modification to occur. So for example, if on a corner lot, someone has a screen fence and wants to go from 5 feet to 6 feet, right? They can submit a minor modification for their home, seeking that additional 1 foot of relief at their property line. If they can demonstrate that, they're changing from an open style to a screen style, right? I think point that you notated, right? It's applying to a single lot, it's not applying to a bevy or a grouping of lots, and that, the HOA does not object to that increase in a single foot of height.
Okay.
Now, once again, that doesn't speak to if an HOA has taken the additional step of being further restrictive in their own CCNRs, which we can't impact. But if all of those align and line up, then we're going to want to try to support that, right? Because there's a justification behind that request. The next opportunity that we have for additional relief, Jordan, next slide, please, would be a variance request. Now that variance request, obviously under hardship rules and practical, which are not self-imposed and not based on finances, would also allow for that additional foot in height or more. Once again, if there's certain conditions that require it, and it can work for multiple lots, just not one lot. Obviously, in our presentation, we also talk about the steps would be allowed in updating the land development code, the PUD zone doc, the PUD permit, and landscape plan. And I would say the only thing I would say with the PUD landscape plan is that, you're in updating that, whereas staff or council could update a PUD zone doc or LDC, it would be wholly reliant upon the HOA or the metro district, which obviously oversees the approval of the landscape plan and or that PUD permit that has that adjoining tract and buffer. They would have to make an application. Once again, the river run effect. So if we can jump to policy questions to consider, Jordan. Sorry, I think, council member, you hit the nail on the head on what are the constraints. Still worth a conversation. What are the constraints in being able to move forward with amending an LDC, amending a PUD, or amending a PUD permit or a landscape plan, right? If you amend the LDC, obviously it would affect any and all residential development going forward that is non-PUD, but it doesn't affect the requirements for the existing PUDs that we have in place. Could you go back and amend the existing PUDs, the 36 PUDs that we have in the Northern Range? You could, My recommendation would be not to, because obviously, one, historically, we as the city would have to be the applicant. We as the city have never historically taken a position of retroactively rezoning property to grant greater flexibility of certain regulatory standards. And in that, right, we would still want some form of consent and support from the residents in taking on that measure in effect. Now, once again, by amending the PUDs, it doesn't necessarily change, or it doesn't change what's in the land development code. And it doesn't change what may be some of the communities that have approved and taken a step further, approving the PUD permits and landscape plans with those fencing standards and requirements, which then turns property into non-conforming properties, which then becomes sticky in and of itself. So what we hear, what we understand, right, moving forward, council wants to provide the flexibility for our residents in being able to determine their fence heights, right? And for various protections of property, aesthetics, and other matters. You know, one of the things that we see and are trying to once again encourage is, you know, staying the course of what we have in our land development code. But right, we do have those developers who have their own vision for what they want to develop, and right, and what do we do if they want to have a shorter fence, right? In order for them to move their project forward, do we look at things on a case-by-case basis? So when we thought about these policy questions and some of these issues that are at hand, and knowing that, right, we're going to be continue to be at that influential forefront of growth and development, how do we manage this situation? Next slide. Obviously, operational impacts, if we were to move forward with changing anything as it relates to amending the existing PUDs, changing the land development code, it's going to be a significant increase in work, particularly with what we're seeing and where the focus has been with new to growth and development. So is that the most effective time for staff in trying to manage our growth and really try to structure development in a sense that, right, is sustainable, is practical, and is stitching itself into the community? Right, the significant workload in of itself, the prioritization of other things that have I would say a legal bearing, the sign code update that we're working through that has a legal bearing due to, I'll say, recent case law with Reed versus Gilbert, that really are driving the priority in how we manage various rights. So when we think about, once again, the future condition, the operational impacts, what we as staff would recommend is continuing to leverage the minor modification option. Because I think it is a balance of what we have in our within our existing codes, within our existing PUDs, and working with our HOA and our metro districts as they want to update their fencing type to engage with them when they see practical based on what they're hearing from their community, that we can then move forward in being able to support. So I think that the minor mod and working with HOA and metro districts, I think, quite frankly, council member, accomplishes that balance that you were looking for before we started talking about certain relief mechanisms.
Councilmember Hurst.
Mr. Rogers, I apologize because I, for some reason, thought the presentation had ended and had in my notes written down answers to question number 2. And that's really where that all came from. So you would have explained it if I just would have shut up. So I appreciate you going back into that. I like the overall kind of, you know, intent behind that, right? If it's not a big enough issue to pass your metro district or HOA board for them to take on with the city to request these minor modifications, then it's probably not that serious of an issue in your community and it doesn't need to be addressed. And I can, I'm not speaking for Councilwoman Noble and I, but I can tell you this will be an issue in our general area, in the mayor's area as well. And for similar reasons as to what we'd all assume, obviously vicious animals, but then just density. As we're building more density up here, it's people telling me they just feel like they want privacy. And so I think the one that the issue that I brought this forward with is also addressed. You know, the gentleman told me, hey, I went to seek a permit doing it what I perceived as the right way to do this. I was denied, but I can stand on my driveway and take a picture of 5 houses with a 6-foot fence. They replaced their 5-foot with the 6-foot. So you're telling me they should either tear theirs down or I can't do what? And I agree with them. And I don't necessarily know that it's a standard or common knowledge that you need to seek a permit for a fence replacement. So I'm not, you know, making assumptions that this person's neighbor or some kind of criminal, you know, but I think this really does begin to address the problem where localized HOAs, government, you know, localized quasi-governmental groups can represent those that they're seeking to represent, like an HOA, and allow a process to where it doesn't overstress our assets, because I don't know if you might have a couple that come out of this immediately, but I suspect it'll take some time before all of the communities want to make an action like this. But overall, I appreciate your guys' assessment of this and the work you did on it.
My pleasure.
Councilmember Noble.
Thank you very much. So what does it mean for an individual or a group of individuals in a certain section? So I can see that your staff recommendation makes sense, of course, but I think you've been allowing that basically all along. That you mentioned the River Run example, and because the HOA came to you, you modified. But what if, let me use a specific example. There are homes on Walden Street that are directly across from the new high school. And the new high school was built quite close to Walden, very little setback. The main entrance to the high school is off of Walden, directly across the street from these homes. Yeah. And all of these homes have 4-foot open fencing. Would they, and you know, they have pets, etc. On the other hand, 2 blocks away are the carriage homes in Reunion, and they have 5-foot screen fencing. I would think that the residents across the street from the high school would be operating under the hardship variance. This is a change to their street, to their environment, to their aesthetics, over which they had no control. And that all of them then, if all of them said, and this strip said, we would like to build 5-foot or 6-foot screen fences, that they could come to the city on a hardship variance and not be required to ask for the permission of the HOA or the Metro District, which are both run by the developer.
So that's a very interesting scenario, council member. And the reason why I say that, right, when we look at the variance conditions, right, we look at hardships that can be topographical, site layout. And I would say it's not one that I will say we have dug into theoretically, just because it has never been approached to us. So that's why I say this is a very interesting scenario that you present, because we have not been presented with that in most recent, with a grouping of residents saying that, you know, this hardship has been placed on us with the adjoining land use and roadway. Now, because an argument could be made that as the zoning was going forward, right, there was an indication of the type of land use that would be established adjacent to said planning area. And that within the planned unit development, which would have looked at the adjacent roadway, or the planned unit development permit, which would have looked at the adjacent roadway characteristics, because in this instance, that fencing was approved, I do believe, as part of the PUD permit and landscape plan for those homes. So it was at that time, the developer, understanding the potential land use allowances on the adjoining properties, had made that decision that the 4-foot fence still demonstrated a mitigation of nuisances, if it being lighting, it being noise, or it just be associated traffic adjacent to a street. So once again, you can make an argument, I see, either way. But at the end of the day, what we've all come to understand, right, is when we have an adjoining property in which that fence sits on, right? That fence doesn't sit on one side of the line, it sits on both sides of the line with your adjoining property ownership. So in that case, right, any application that is for a variance or a minor modification, depending upon the ownership, has to hence be submitted and or receive the support from said property owner. So in that instance, the fence is also sitting on a shared property line with the HOA or the Metro District. Now, let's say the property owners were willing to all to come together and file an application for a variance to the city seeking a greater height in fencing, right, for the multiple lots. There's two things that are at play here within that specific scenario. In that one, if the HOA is not a party of that application, you do not have full property ownership to submit that application. Two, once again, even though that variance request may be granted, if the HOA or the Metro District has CC&Rs that are still restrictive than the city's approvals, their standards and their constraints and restrictive covenants will still take, would still have the strict administration and apply. So in this case,
What was the last thing? Explain that last part again, please.
so even if a variance was granted, now this is assuming that, right, let's say the HOA doesn't have a play here. Just to help, so I can help make my statement. Say the HOA doesn't have a play here, and the property owners are able to move forward with a variance application to increase the height of the fence from 4 feet to 6 feet. However, if the HOA CC&Rs are still restricted to 4 feet, the 4 feet would still apply and would have to still be adhered to by the property owner. Because once again, the HOA's CC&Rs are outside of our process, and they can be more restrictive, but they cannot be less. So if they apply a more restrictive rule, those rules will apply. And the property owners would still have to adhere with those. So that's where I say this, your scenario is unique because one, the HOA would have to sign off on that application to be a party of the variance, which at the same time, if they are doing so, you would assume then yes, they're then going to modify their requirements and their standards for fencing heights and or restrictions within their CC&Rs to support. What we have seen and what's been, I would say, the complexity in this issue is that we are aware that property owners are seeking to move forward with increasing their heights adjacent to this roadway and to this use. However, the HOA has not been supportive of that application, or the Metro District has not been supportive of that application because they have their own regulations and requirements to the approved fence heights. And in this instance, what they would simply have to do, and my understanding is that they would have to simply apply to amend the PUD permit. But once again, they haven't been able to receive my understanding, support for submittal of that application.
Mm. Interesting. So we're looking at, in fact, anywhere you buy in this area, in the northern area where the PUDs exist, buyer beware. And you need to read through your CCNRs extremely carefully.
Mhm.
And apparently, go to the planning department and look up all PUDs that might be pending so that you can also see what might be coming across the street from you or where the streets might be. So a lot to look at. And then you need to take it to the HOA as opposed to the city. But I would also say that we as a city need to be cautious about what we approve for the community when we're talking about neighborhoods with open rail fences, for example. On the one hand, as you point out, it's good to be able to see what's on the other side of the fence and that you don't end up with these tunnels, if you will. But at the same time, it also gives people access and gives animals a different sort of access or escape route that they wouldn't have normally, which then puts the safety of the community at risk as well. So it's fences can make good neighbors, but they're also extremely complicated and have good and bad sides, that's for sure.
Yes, ma'am. And I appreciate your statements. I think, you know, right, if we're looking at ourselves in a mirror, and I mean this not as a negative, but once again, it's continuing to try to, as we continue to grow as a community, you know, the simplest things as fences become that much more complex because of just the dynamic aspects of how a developer sees growth, development, how it structures, and how it then ultimately stitches in. So, you know, I would say, like I said, our staff is being very due diligent in trying to navigate that. In particular, I think, you know, one of those navigations is trying to make the process a little bit more accessible, or by accessible, removal of a certain step. So there is that ability then to limit the impact on our residents, right? That building permit aspect. But really being able to help them galvanize and knowing that, right, there's the regulatory rules and other processes that are in play that they can leverage without having to wait another 6-8 weeks to get through a permitting process for a fence to go up. So I think a lot of it is also that we're trying to educate more upfront about the various rules and regulations, and thinking that, right, one last step is going to actually be one step forward for our residents in being able to navigate that complexity of a process with existing and or future. But I would definitely tell you, it's definitely something that we are looking at going forward, is to how do we make the fencing requirements once again more streamlined and more effective with new development.
And I do want it to be made very clear that when people are told that it's Commerce City who's making the decision about their fences and not the HOA or the Metro District, that in fact might be that is not the case, and that they need to get the HOA or the Metro District to change it if that's what they want to have done. I certainly can accept the fact that the aesthetics that go along with some of these fence designs are part of what make the communities inviting. And so there's a lot of things to weigh, and everybody has to have a say in this as well. But the finger pointing has been, you know, it has been towards Commerce City, and that makes people unsure about where they are supposed to be making their appeal. So I think you're helping make that clear, that it needs to be at the HOA or the Metro District level.
And like I said, if it's an individual lot, we're more than willing to work with individual residents as it relates to the fencing on corner lots, right? You know, we've outlined the minor modification process. We've outlined how to go through the variance process. And, you know, I think as it relates, you know, we serve as stewards to help educate our residents as it relates to, well, who's on first, who's on second. And quite frankly, we want to make sure that they have all the tools at hand so that they can understand what steps that they need to take. And quite frankly, what are other options that are available to them? We have tried to navigate with residents in particular to that scenario that you discussed that, well, while maybe you might not be able to increase the height of your fence as you're working through the matter with the HOA or the Metro District, there's nothing stopping by looking at other landscape options or solutions, right? There's nothing saying that you can't put up additional landscaping of cypress pines at the back of your property to help, once again, provide that additional mitigation. So there's other options that we will also try to present when, once again, certain regulatory steps they can't move forward with because of other externalities or limitations. So we do still try to work and help them as much as we possibly can.
I think a conversation with you by some of these residents would probably be worthwhile because unfortunately they also have a regulation in their CCNRs that they're not able to build trees, to plant trees along their fence, that they have to be set back from their fence by, I think, half the distance, something like 10, 15 feet. So they don't even have that option. I think it's worthwhile to have a chat with you or a Zoom chat with you so they can get some of these questions addressed. Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. I really appreciate you taking the time to go through this.
My pleasure, ma'am, and I would welcome that conversation.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments regarding the fence height discussion? Seeing none, thank you for putting all that together and for the time dedicated to this effort. We'll now move on to reports. Mr. Tingelberg, City Manager.
Yeah, before I get into my report, just a quick question. Is there a particular direction that council wants staff to go in?
Councilmember Hurst.
I think what was presented as options is something that I'd be willing to see us just educate and continue to, prioritize and not make, groups wait for a long time to get an answer on something like that. But if that works, I don't see a need for anything else. But if I'm sure we'll find out if there's problems with that. That, I guess, is the easiest way to say it. And then we can address it as needed from there, in my opinion.
So if I may, Roger, just summarize what my takeaway for the community development team is: one, continue to leverage the minor modification process on a case-by-case basis as we receive those inquiries from the community. Two, we're continuing to move forward with a removal of the requirement to submit an actual just permit to throw up posts and planks, but still have the requirement of establishing the rules of the road. Once again, for aesthetics and character. And two, three, continue to educate of the various processes that are available and help either an HOA, a Metro District, or a property owner or a group of property owners to navigate the process.
Does that sound acceptable to everyone? All right, I'm seeing nods, thumbs. Good, thank you.
Thank you all.
Just wanted to make sure we kind of closed the loop on that. So then moving on to my report, just a few things. One is there was a governor's bill signing last Friday. We received short notice on it, and I was able to attend. Representative Benavides thanked the mayor for testifying regarding that bill, which was concerning the air quality monitoring. Just a couple updates on developments. Legato, there's a draft intergovernmental agreement that's been created, and that's being reviewed right now. So, and that would be between the Metro Districts at Legato and us. And then Hammer, we created a checklist, and they've agreed on everything on the checklist except for the annexation phasing. So we're continuing to discuss that. As I mentioned before, work is underway on the 2022 budget. And in light of that, we've been reviewing the 2021 reappropriation and evaluating the impact of the reappropriation requests on the 2022 budget. And so that could be significant. So looking at some changes to the reappropriation, but again, we'll bring that to you later in July. And then on a personal note, my wife's family is having a reunion at Steamboat. And so I'll be out of the office July 8th through the 15th. And Jason Rogers will be the acting city manager during that time. Depending on Wi-Fi availability, I will attempt to join City Council on the 12th in the study session, because we'll be talking about the proposed programs for the American Rescue Plan Act. So that's fairly significant, but it all depends on Wi-Fi availability. So few other things. We received annexation and rezoning application to permit up to 714 residential units on Anderson Farms. That's south of 104th Avenue, west of Chambers Road. And then the quick trips, we're awaiting resubmittal from the applicant for both sites on that. And then we have a proposal, well, I shouldn't say proposal. We are anticipating a request for the annexation and rezoning of 684 acres south of 104th Avenue, and that would be in the Third Creek South area. So east of E470, south of 104th. And again, 684 acres, so very large tract of land. And then just several things about parks. From June 29, so tomorrow, to July 4, Pioneer Park will be hosting the Triple Crown softball tournament. And so you'll see a lot of activity around Pioneer Park during that time. Monaco Park, there was an irrigation booster pump that failed. So irrigation is happening at about 50% capacity. And it'll take about 2 weeks before we're able to replace that pump. So you may see some grass quality issues at Monaco. If it keeps raining like it did this weekend, then certainly not. But so pray for rain. Stampede Park, we were doing the drill and fill operation. If you recall, we bought a piece of equipment either last year or the year before to deal with poor turf conditions. And that's where they drill a core down and replace the dirt with sand to improve drainage and soil quality. That's about 60% complete, but we had to reassign staff to another area. And so not sure when we'll be getting back to that, but anyway, just wanted to give a quick update on that. And we had mentioned earlier this evening at the CCURA meeting that we have 2 proposals for hotels, 2 different developers. So hopefully we'll see what comes out of that. That's it for my report. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Tinklenberg regarding his report? Seeing none, thank you for the update, and I would encourage you to not get on the Zoom meeting on the 12th and enjoy your time in Steamboat Springs and away from the rest of us. And next up, Mr. Sheasley.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council. Just a brief update on July the 7th, a plan in the bankruptcy for Purdue Pharmaceuticals is going to be likely approved, and then any creditor, including the city, that has filed a notice of claim gets to vote on that plan by July 14th. We, with our special counsel, are going to be making a recommendation to the city manager as to how to vote on that plan. And I will be forwarding, once we speak, forwarding what that recommendation is to council. If there's any dispute about that, council would need to schedule a special meeting next week, sometime preferably on July 6th, to discuss that. I don't anticipate controversy over it though. like the city manager, I will be out the latter half of next week. My folks are coming to Denver to visit, and I haven't seen them since February of last year. So it's a very exciting time. That's my report. Happy 4th of July.
Thank you, Mr. Sheasley. Does anybody on council have any questions for Mr. Sheasley regarding his report? Seeing none, thank you for your report and enjoy the time with your parents. Any council members wishing to make a report? Councilmember Noble?
Thanks so much. I've been exploring committees with the National League of Cities, and I was invited to join the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Committee, and I wanted to accept that as long as no one has any objections.
I don't see any. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Any other council members wishing to make a report? Seeing none, I do not have anything to add myself, so that will conclude our meeting for this evening. There is no meeting next week in honor of Independence Day. Hope everybody has an opportunity to get out and enjoy themselves over the long weekend, and remember the purpose of what Independence Day is all about, and of course partake in the fireworks at Dick's Sporting Goods Park following the Rapids game. We will see you on July 12th for a study session. Good night.